gonna be good. I'm excited. I'm excited. So I'm glad people are joining and participating.
Me too.
Um, Can you see my face, Annie?
Yes, I can see your face.
Okay, because I can't see me. I can't see anything. I can't see you and I can't see me.
Oh,
But that's fine. You know, it's just me and the presenter screen hanging out.
cool.
You're waiting. If you make sure that you have your workbook available, so that you can have that as a reference as we go through.
Yeah, so that was sent to your email. If you did not receive it, I'm putting a link to it into the chat box as well. So you can go ahead and download that. So that's a editable PDF. So once you have it, you can download that and you can type right into the workbook. Or if you're more comfortable, you can go ahead and put that all down on with pencil and paper, if that's your preference.
Or print it, whatever you prefer. Mhm.
Right. Well, we can go ahead and get started. My name is Annie Tillman. I'm the Adult Program Coordinator here at the Schaumburg Library. I'm so glad that you guys are joining us for the second part in our Understanding Race, Racism, and Anti-Racism for Families. So today we have Asia Lyons joining us, and she'll be able to get us started.
Yeah. Well, welcome everyone. And for those of you who were with us last week, welcome back and hope that you all will be able to hang out with us next Thursday and the Thursday afterwards as we dive into anti racism in a two-part series on anti racism. But my name is Asia Lyons. I'm so excited to be here. Make sure that if you have any questions that you put them in the chat box. I can see the questions, and Annie, I know those of folks in the YouTube channel, she's going to cut and paste the questions onto the chat over here. So really excited to get started. So this part of the series is called Understanding Racism. It's Complicated. And unlike the first workshop or in the series, we have less to do as far as the reflection is concerned and like immediate things that we're doing inside of our workshop, and it's more of the listening and thinking about the complexities of racism in this group. I know that we definitely have some people who have families who will be joining us, so feel free to have your children come with. They can move in and out of the space if that's what works for you all. But this is definitely a place or like a time that we're talking about the different forms of racism. So let's go ahead and get started. First things first. So, what brought me to this work? Again, my name is Asia Lyons. For those of us who saw the series last week, this is a repeat, but I am originally from Detroit, Michigan. Went to school at the University of Michigan on their Dearborn campus. I have my doctorate, or excuse me, I have my master's and my bachelor's in elementary education and teacher leadership. I'm a student at the University of Colorado, Denver. I'm in Denver right now, where I'm receiving my doctorate in leadership for educational equity. And I'm also a adjunct professor there, adjunct instructor for their School of Education program. I am married and I have a daughter, Zoe, and my husband, Cliff. I taught in a school district in Denver, or Denver area, excuse me, for 12 years. And I moved over to nonprofit sector where you see where it says Rise, Colorado. Finally decided to start my own consulting firm, Lyons Educational Consulting. And a big part of our work is engaging with families and community members around writing curriculum and programming for families and for young folks focused on culturally responsive learning and teaching. right. So the 4 agreement contract, same as last time if you were here. We have 4 agreements, and these 4 agreements are not my own. They are from Pacific Educational Group, and they basically are talking about the ways that we engage in race-based conversation. So we're staying engaged. We are speaking our truth. So if you're in the chat box and you're talking, you're sharing, it is your story that you're sharing, not the stories of other people or something that you heard from someone else. You're experiencing discomfort, and for you to be in this space right now may be uncomfortable for you, but you understand it's necessary. So thank you for being in discomfort. We also ask that you understand that you need to expect and accept non-closure. No amount of professional developments or amount of books that you read are going to end racism. However, we continue the work regardless. So when I talk about the 4 agreement contract in your workbook, there is a contract. And if you read it last time, it basically talks about the 4 agreements. And the contract is for you and your family to basically promise yourself that you will continually show up, stay engaged, speak your truth, experience discomfort, and expect and accept non-closure. I would suggest at the end of this series, perhaps tearing this out of your workbook or printing it, putting on the refrigerator or some other place where you all work, or maybe have your family meetings or you engage as a family so that you can see all ways that you have dedicated yourself to racial consciousness and racial awareness. So when you have a minute, and again, it's editable, and if it's not, then you can print it later. Put your name, your family's name, your children's names, if you have children, and then you can sign it. Also, before we get started, I want to make sure, as far as the workbook is concerned, at the bottom of each of your pages in your workbook are going to be links for different types of resources. So, for example, in the first page after the contract, it says interpersonal racism. At the bottom, all the links you see, you can click on to receive support around articles. You can, there will be a few videos, lesson plans, and then other learning opportunities. And I was really intentional about putting lesson plans into the workbook because I wanted you all to make sure that you had some way of teaching your children. If you wanted to make that more structural, if you want to incorporate that into your language arts, English, any types of subjects, that you had some supports there. So that's an opportunity for you to integrate that. Some of you who are either homeschooling or taking the information from your child's school and bringing it home and teaching them, this is a good way to supplement what they are learning in school if they're not learning about race, racism, and anti-racism. Okay, first things first, reflection question. And I need you to go ahead and type this in the chat box, so be ready for this. Just a number. What percentage of your life do you believe is impacted by race? So a number between 0% and 100%. In the chat box, go ahead and type it in. Making sure everything's good on my side with the screen. Okay, let's see here. So, oh, go ahead.
We're just trying to get the technical stuff worked out with the screen because I noticed that there were a couple of boxes on there. So Asia and I are working to get that fixed for you.
Yeah, thank you. Do you see the screen? What are you seeing now?
We're seeing the presenter view still.
Because I keep swapping it and I wonder what's happening. Give me a second. Let's see here. What are you seeing now?
We lost the screen.
Oh boy. No worries. I got this. Now?
Now we see the presentation.
All right. We're back in action. Okay. So I have a few responses. Some folks are saying 20%, 50%, 75%, 90%. So really a reflection of like how does race, like what percentage of your life do you believe is impacted by race? And when we're thinking about that question, depending on your number, you're probably thinking like, am I impacted by racism, right? How is racism impacting me? Are there people of color around me? Am I a person of color that's impacted by other people of color? So the way that you're answering that question probably depends on the ways in which you're thinking about the question, right? And so I hope that you were thinking, what percentage of your life do you believe is impacted by race and not necessarily racism, okay? So next, and we'll talk about this more at the end. Okay. So quick review from last week, the differences between race, ethnicity, and nationality. So race is our color, the ways in which you are identified by others and yourself based solely on skin color and your physical characteristics. So physical characteristics being hair texture, could be nose shape, could be eye shape, could be size of lips, things like that. Ethnicity is your culture, the way in which you live, the music and food and heroes that you have. Culture can be very much regional. We talked about this last week in saying that all people of color, all Black people in the United States of America do not have the same types of culture. I would say that Southern culture, perhaps in Mobile, Alabama, could be totally different than the Black culture, whatever the Black culture is, but people who are Black in Los Angeles or who are in Massachusetts. So thinking about culture, even from people who, African Americans who've been here since slavery, even though they may have a similar history, even their culture can be totally different, right? And then your nationality is your corner, like which corner of the earth you're occupying. So your nationality, your citizenship by birth or naturalization or specified in your government issued passport. And I mentioned last time, we need to also be aware that if you were not born here and you are undocumented, but you feel like this is your nationality, this is your home, this is your corner, then there it is, right? And no one can tell you different. Okay, so what is racism? And you notice right away, there's two different definitions of racism on this screen. One is the very basic, a system of oppression that not only stigmatizes and violates the targeted group, so a specific group that's being targeted, Asian Americans, indigenous peoples, things like that, but also does psychic and ethical violence to the dominator or white group as well. So it's not just that racism oppresses a person of color, it is also oppressive to white people as well. And I say that because the whole goal of essentially living is to be fully human, right? To be able to live our full experiences. And when we are in our full experience, sorry, my daughter is talking to me right now. So in order to live in our full experiences and to be fully human, we're all right now missing out, right? We're all not being able to be our full selves. So that's the idea. Everyone is suffering through racism. Some people are definitely suffering far more than others. Anti-Black racism is a very specific type of racism that refers to the relationship between Blackness and humanity, right? And it is so that Black people are dehumanized and oppressed far more than most all other groups of people in the United States. There is a book or there's a statement from the Combahee River Collective that says that like when Black women are free, we are all free, because as an intersection, and we can talk about this some other time, as an intersection, Black women are at the, what you would say, the bottom of the barrel, the most oppressed. And so when Black women are able to be humanized and fully human, everyone above us is able to be fully human. So yes, we often hear about racism, we often hear about bias, but very rarely do we talk about anti-Black racism or anti-Blackness. So it would be important, if you're doing this work, to definitely do some research on that if you have the time. And I have in your packet a little article about anti-Blackness that I read from Yes Magazine that I really love. Okay, so the 4 types of racism we're going to go over today. And again, it's complicated and we won't be able to dig into every single one, but this is where we start. So your interpersonal racism, systemic, also known as institutional racism, your cultural racism, and then your environmental racism. So all the ways that racism impacts the United States, the world, in different directions and different angles. So starting off, understanding that racism can be overt and covert at the same time, right? And I'm going to read this just for you all, so that I know some of us like to read as people are presenting. And if you aren't able to read, then I'm reading it for you. So racism, thoughts and or actions that perpetrate the beliefs and attitudes that the white race is superior to all other races. And those actions can be overt, right? Overt being so that they're very open, and or covert, so like undercover. Examples of overt racism that can be easily identified: white students chatting, build the wall in their school lunchroom is overt racism. Covert racism looks something like a neighborhood that's mostly filled with cash poor people of color, does not have a grocery store in walking distance, right? Or their playground equipment is constantly broken and not replaced, versus a neighborhood that does not have cash poor people of color whose equipment is replaced consistently. So those aren't, we're not necessarily saying with the neighborhood grocery store not being there, like, oh, we're trying to be racist, and we're making sure that we say that. It's very covert. They might say something like, oh, they don't like that kind of grocery store here, or they won't be able to afford the food in that grocery store. So you may see grocery stores that are not in the same types of neighborhoods, a Whole Foods versus a Save-A-Lot, right? And you wouldn't see a Save-A-Lot type grocery store in a very upper middle class family neighborhood. Okay. So multiple dimensions of oppression, and we're specifically talking about the oppression of racism. It is complex. So we're talking about conscious and unconscious. So things we know and the things we don't even think about. It shows up in our interpersonal relationships. It shows up in entire systems, which we'll talk about. And then it shows up in our social and cultural behaviors as well. And how does that show up again? In our attitudes towards people and towards ourselves, and our behaviors towards people and ourselves. So really, it's very much a 3-dimensional, if not more, system. And if we are to be honest, if we're thinking about that, if we're just talking about racism as this box, if we talk about all the forms of oppression that go with it, sexism, ableism, heterosexism, religious oppression, if we talk about all the different forms of oppression connected to racism, then that box gets even more complex. But again, today, for right now, we're talking about conscious and unconscious oppression specific to racism. Okay, interpersonal racism first. So it's the manifestation of beliefs in the inferiority of a racial or ethnic group at the individual level through person-to-person exchanges, through conversation and confrontation. This would be the most often talked about form of racism. So if you're going to maybe a DEI workshop at perhaps your job or some other place, they might talk about having courageous conversations about race, speaking up to your racist uncle at Thanksgiving and what you should do, right? So having a lot of those conversations, we might see videos of people like yelling out racial slurs at each other. So that's a lot of interpersonal racism. So when we're reading a lot of books that are coming out right now, a lot of the books are talking about how to deal with interpersonal between each other and to ourselves in that form of racism. So very, very much an easier, compared to others, it's easier to identify interpersonal racism. And it's easier to have that conversation. May not be easier to convince that person of the thing that they said was incorrect or their behavior is wrong, but that's a face-to-face. So you'll see a lot of folks and a lot of webinars, a lot of, let's see, I don't expect special groups coming together to really talk about, and book clubs too, that's a big one, talking about interpersonal racism because it's the most common. And this video is going to give you an example of interpersonal racism.
My sister-in-law, who's half black, half white, but looks white, blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me. And she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who is a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? Isn't it a nice day today? They're just chatting up. And she says, yeah. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point, my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you gotta choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is a book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over. And she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been, she goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the 2 white elderly ladies go, oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. It is totally unacceptable. At which point the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, this is unfair. Why are you doing this to me? Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
So with interpersonal racism, that's a perfect example. The having conversation of this is what you can do in the day-to-day. Because in the day-to-day, we can experience and see and witness and speak up a little easier than other forms of racism when we're going through our day-to-day life. So in this situation, the sister-in-law, Kathleen, who is white presenting, multiracial, but white presenting, was able to advocate in this interpersonal racist situation for her sister-in-law, right? We'll get into a little later about the daughter and her perspective and how that may have affected or did affect the daughter. But then again, that is a big piece of it. It's the interpersonal. So the interpersonal is the day-to-day, the everyday conversations, the book clubs, the conversations, the church group gatherings that we typically talk about when we talk about disrupting racism is through the interpersonal, the person to person. The next we're going to talk about is systemic racism. So we're going from the personal here, and we're going to blow that all the way up. And we're thinking about this as a larger, much, much more complex system. So what is systemic oppression? It's the codifying oppression in laws, policies, practices, and norms. So instead of it just being me to you, now we're talking about the complexities of the healthcare system, education systems, legal systems, religious organizations, which causes wealth gaps, redlining, and other opportunity gaps. So an example of systemic racism in education is the opportunity gap. And if you haven't heard the opportunity gap basically says that Black and brown children achieve lower than the standard of education and standards in schooling across the board, right? And if your mind goes, well, that's because Black children don't work hard, or that's because their parents don't work with them, be careful with your mindset, right? What's happening is systemically, there's bias and racism in education through teachers. There's bias and racism in education through policies for children around discipline and punishment. There's expectations that are far lower for Black and brown children, and please feel free to research these things, right? So we talk about the system of education and how it is it's unjust to Black and brown and Indigenous children. And that's how it shows up. It's system-wide. So we can't just point at one teacher, right? Or one test, but we're looking at all the years, the historical pieces, all the years and all the people and all the policies and all the procedures and the police officers or SROs or whomever, security in the schools, all playing into systemic racism in education, right? Another example, and we'll watch a video about this, is systemic racism in healthcare, right? And women, Black and brown women and Indigenous women receiving poorer health care in the same facilities as white women. Legal systems or justice systems. It's right now in Colorado, marijuana has been legalized and has been for a while now. And so we're having this conversation of people who have been imprisoned, mostly Black and brown people who have been put in jail for using marijuana or selling marijuana. Should they be released, right? Because legal, then should we be releasing folks from prison? And why were they imprisoned in the first place? So there's like lots of different systems, and they don't work separately. The education system is connected to the prison system. And if you ever heard of the pipeline to prison, it's because they're connected. We know that a lot of prisons are owned privately. And so there's money to be made when we have prisoners in jails filling up beds. So how do we get more people into those systems? So again, it's very, very complex, and we can go on and on and on. But systemic racism is harder to identify because it looks like, oh, it's just one person or one thing, or it just happens to be this way, and it's always been this way. And sometimes we don't think of it any differently. I'll give you one more example, which is redlining. So redlining has been historic. It was about the redlining or sectioning off of parts of neighborhoods all over the country that were specific for Black and brown folks to only live in these spaces and white folks to live in other spaces. So what would happen? Real estate agents would guide Black people into certain areas, and they weren't even shown neighborhoods that they could afford in white areas, right? If somehow you were able to get a home in a white neighborhood, you were either ran out of your neighborhood, perhaps you would have a cross burning in your lawn, someone would break your window, someone would like aggravate your children, or every white person in the neighborhood would just move out. right? And then it would fill up with people of color. So we look at your suburbs now, you look at your neighborhoods now, you think, well, it's just a lot of white people near me, and that's just how it is. But is that how it is, or has there been a history of what we call redlining in your community that's caused the separation that now is really difficult to undo, right? So I'll give you a shout out. Jay Smooth has tons and tons of videos. I put his videos in our workbook for this week. This week. And there's lots of different topics about systemic racism. I chose the one on infant mortality, but there's lots of others that you can take a look at if you're interested, but we'll watch this one. It's really quick.
Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. You know, if you're like most Americans, you probably say to yourself all the time, systemic racism. Is that really a thing? Well, did you know that even though America's infant mortality down in the last 50 years, black babies are still about 2.5 times more likely to die before reaching their first birthday? Did you know that black mothers are 3 times more likely to die during childbirth? That black and Hispanic women are more than twice as likely not to receive proper prenatal care? And Native American mothers are 3 times less likely to receive proper care? Did you know that? Do you know what that's called? That's called systemic racism. And yes, it's really a thing.
To learn more about systemic racism, forward.org and donate today to support racial justice.
So the complexities of systemic racism go wide and deep. Even at birth or before birth, children of color, newborns, babies in utero of color are experiencing systemic racism, right? At no fault of their own. And again, if you're telling yourself, well, that's because blah, 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 or this is because they didn't do this or this or this right, check your racism, check your bias, right? Again, it's well researched. Please do the research, understand how our healthcare system works. I was at the dentist yesterday and I was talking to my dentist about like how I've always been to the dentist, a different dentist, and always had pain when I got cavities done. And she said, she had read an article. Now she's digging in my mouth, meanwhile talking to me about this. And she said, I just read an article that was written for doctors, and it said that doctors do not prescribe the proper amounts of pain medication to women, and they do not provide or give the proper amount of pain medication to Black people, with the assumption that we can handle pain or that we're stronger. And then she said, she's working on my cavity, and you being a Black woman, it's even harder, right? So this white woman is telling me this, and it's just a perfect example of, and I'm totally comfortable in this chair, and it was totally fine. But what she was saying was, yeah, I believe you. We've talked about that when we talk about anti-racism, believing the lived experiences of others. But I think that's really important. And she said, yeah, that's absolutely true. I hear what you're saying, and I believe you, right? So systemically in the healthcare industry, we're thinking about the healthcare industry. We're thinking about prenatal care. We're thinking about geriatrics with our seniors, our elderly, and our most vulnerable populations. Whew, I am going so fast. So next we're talking about cultural racism, okay? So cultural racism is the norms and patterns that perpetuate values that bind institutions and individuals. So now we're talking about institutional racism and individual behaviors of racism combined, right? And so what that does is create norms around what is good and what is bad, philosophies of life, beauty, the norm, healthy, deviance, sickness, perspectives on time, and such. So with social and cultural norms, I'll give you a perfect example. The color nude, right? Nude is meaning naked, so like the color of flesh. But what color is nude? If I were to put on a nude colored shirt, right, is that going to match my nude color? Well, the answer is, of course it would not, right? So institutions of clothing and industry, shopping industry, And individuals have pushed to say that nude equals the skin color of white folks, or most white folks, or lighter skinned people, right? And so that's a perfect example of cultural racism. I give the example all the time of something like Band-Aids, right? Now we have the Paw Patrol Band-Aids and different Band-Aids, but if you're going for like a plain Band-Aid, the color is nude. Again, it's meant to blend in. But I know that a nude colored Band-Aid is not going to blend in. So then I'm experiencing with something so simple as a Band-Aid, cultural racism. Same with, so back to the beauty standards, and what does it mean to be beautiful? Does that mean that you have long straight hair? Does that mean you have smaller lips or fuller lips? Whatever society ran by by whiteness, by white people and white culture, whatever they say beauty is, it is. And the rest of us have to conform to it, right? Or we're considered out of the norm, or defiant, or deviant, right? So social and cultural racism, again, is very complex. Now we're not talking about being in hospitals. Now we're not talking about necessarily being in the classroom, but it's the everyday. It's sitting and watching commercials. And if you can have free, I don't know if people watch commercials anymore, but if you watch advertisements or commercials or television shows, and you just come up with, and this is very simple, come up with a tally mark of how many Black people you see in commercials who have certain types of hair, like a loose curly hair versus a straight hair versus an afro, right? And just do some tallying around what you see. And so media and film helps decide what is normal. And to see a whole television show with women with afros, and the show is not about the 60s or 70s, you would think like, what's going on? Why are they wearing their hair in that way, right? Where if the hair comes out of your scalp in the way that it comes out, which for some of us is a little tighter, coilier, kinkier than others, then that's the way it grows, right? And I did not mention this in the institutional systemic racism slide, but another example here in Denver, they just passed what's called the Crown Act. And basically the Crown Act was an act that had to be passed by our legislator that basically said that Black people could not be discriminated against for wearing their hair in natural styles. Natural styles meaning a hairstyle where your hair is not completely straight, right? Professional. We can wear it the way it comes out of our scalp naturally, or we can wear locks, and I have locks behind my scarf. And so there actually has to be law passed to say it's illegal to discriminate against people of color, specifically Black folks, so that they can wear their hair the way they want, or we want to wear it. That's a form of institutional and cultural racism. Why is that a thing, right? And if the answer is, well, we have to have a respectable office building space, or we have to make sure that everyone looks professional, then I ask the question, who determines what professional means? Think about it. Who says that this color, this suit, this outfit, this thing, these types of shoes, this hairstyle is professional, right? That's the question. And the answer to that question is cultural racism. It is white culture. White culture decides that. Now you may be thinking, well, I didn't decide that, and I want to wear shorts to work, and I want to wear a t-shirt. But we're not talking about individuals, we're talking about entire systems, right? So something to be thinking about is cultural racism and how it shows up. Pay attention. It's really every single place, okay? Another part of our social and cultural racism is colorism. And they'll explain it more in the video, but a big part of colorism is talking about even just, the difference between skin colors in the same culture. So not only do we have experienced racism between colors of people, right? Anti-Black racism. Can you close the door, please, Lily? Thank you. Put the box down. Anti-Black racism. You're talking about people who are discriminated against because they're darker in their own race, right? which is very complex. And I know some people are like, what? I didn't know that was a thing. Why does it make a difference? But colorism is real. And the lighter you are in most societies, the better off your life is. So here we go.
It's something that I don't usually talk about because I'm afraid that I'm making people uncomfortable. It's something that affects me in almost every aspect of life.
There's something about having dark skin on a woman's body that shapes the way she moves through the world. There's something about having darker skin on a male body that shapes the way in which he moves through the world. It has real life stakes.
From what I've seen growing up, dark skin equates to being poor,
Dirty, ratchet.
They tend to be the bad guys in Tyler Perry movies.
Straight from the border.
That doesn't even make any sense. I'm not deemed as beautiful, therefore I am not beautiful. And those two are not really mutually exclusive.
Could it be that something as early as colonization or slavery is primarily responsible for our beauty standards today? We're talking about who works in the field and who works in the house. We're also talking about rape, the rape of slaves to produce people who are known as mulattoes or mixed race. These standards of beauty travel. Eurocentric standards of beauty travel.
In the Dominican society and our culture, they have a phrase that's like mejorando la raza, advancing the Dominican population and making sure we're going into how they say the better. If you're lighter, you're bettering the race and you're bettering the island versus if you're just being you.
I would get called the blackness. One joke that really stuck with me was like, oh, Edgar's so black that when he leaves a car, the check engine light turns on. That was a reference to my skin being as dark as oil. I felt ugly being of a darker skin tone. So I tried to gel my hair, or I started listening to skater punk music. So I tried culturally to lighten myself, if that makes sense.
I went on a trip to Korea with my mom. Some woman walked up to my mom and she asked, "Why is your daughter so dark?" In Korea, you have to be pale, and I almost felt like a foreigner and not so much Korean anymore. When we turn off the lights, they say, "Oh, Salorm, where did you go?" Or, "Oh, you're really pretty for a dark-skinned girl." Are you saying that my race and just the fact that I am black, is that not attractive in general?
I remembered one time that I wanted to be an angel in a parade. At that time, they were like kind of racist, you know, they didn't like black people to be angels. And my mommy got kind of freaked out. She was going like, "Please you cannot be an angel because they're gonna laugh at you." I said, "But mommy, I am an angel." And finally, I was an angel. And I was the only black angel walking in the street. And my mommy was so proud about it, and I was proud too.
My mom started buying me a cream called Fair and Lovely. I was in 3rd grade when I started using bleaching creams. And the whole general idea was, if I'm lighter, I'll have a better life. I'll find somebody that's gonna love me. There would still be light and dark patches on my body and my face. It's painful, it would hurt, and I started breaking out in like bad rashes, and no one said anything. I had to stop it myself.
How do we fix this? We think critically about colorism. We think about where it began and where it begins and ends with us.
I think change starts with providing more diversity. You know, providing more examples of people that look like you.
If you look at telenovelas, they usually cast the dark-skinned person as the villain. And if you never met a Latino before, you're gonna somewhat think that.
So in Japanese media, I honestly don't think I've ever seen a darker skinned female. I feel it would be nice to see a change.
It needs to start within our own culture, where we can't have Will Smith filling in every slot for black people. Giving dark-skinned people roles that are not only supporting roles, but leading roles.
I mean, a legit badass 007 Latino James Bond, that'd be pretty dope. I'm just saying.
If I could give a message to someone like me,
who's kind of looking at himself and feeling insecure.
Just know, baby, you beautiful.
Believe in yourself.
Just be you.
You are perfect just the way you are. That's something that no one has ever told me.
And your skin color is a gift. It's never been a blemish or a problem.
When you grow up and you look in the mirror and you're proud of who you are, it will make sense and all the other voices will go away. And all that's going to be left is you.
And I saw in the chat that people can't see the video. Annie, was it just one person or lots of people?
It looks like just one person, but if you're having trouble seeing the video in Zoom, it looks like she's going to log out and back in. We can also watch it on YouTube as well at schaumburglibrary.tv.
Thank you, Annie. And I'm sorry I didn't see that until just now. And I'm trying to click the chat and it kept stopping the video. So that video and talking about colorism is a perfect example of anti-Blackness, right? Because it's like we need across multiple cultures. This is what I really loved about that video is multiple cultures from different places around the world have the same message. It's better to be light. You cannot be Black. You cannot be dark. Dark is bad. Light is better. You'll have a better life. If you cannot be white, you should at least be light, right? So that's a perfect example. Skin bleaching creams, one of the people talked about, she said, you know, she would break out in these rashes and bumps, and that is still happening all over. I just saw a documentary that's a little bit older about Jamaican women using bleaching creams and like from like bar soap, bar bleaching for their clothing on their skin, right? With the idea of, I want to be lighter. I'm more attractive if I'm lighter. Well, you have to think about like, where would someone get that idea from? Why would they get that idea that being lighter is better or being lighter skin is going to give you a better life? And the answer is cultural racism. It's the television. It's what their parents and family are telling them. It's the way society picks and chooses who gets jobs and job interviews. It's the way that systems, healthcare systems and schooling systems treat students and adults who are lighter skinned. A perfect example, a part of my research for my doctorate talks about racism historically in education. And so a lot of people know that Brown versus Board of Education ended segregation of supposedly ended segregation in schools in the United States. What people do not know is that there were about 84 to 85,000 Black teachers teaching at the time of Brown versus Board, and half of those teachers were fired, right? The other half, the other 40,000 or so, were either demoted to janitors, they were principals to teachers, things like that. And a majority of the people who were left, who were moved to white schools, because all the Black schools closed down. So all the teachers who were moved from the Black schools to teaching the white schools and allowed to keep their job, or most of them were lighter skinned, right? So nothing to do with ability, nothing to do with credentials, nothing to do with anything else, but if you're not going to be white in front of our white children, the least you could be is light, right? And we can get into the systems of now why we don't see Black people, a lot of Black folks in education. Less than 5% of teachers are Black males, and the systems and histories of that. But again, institutional racism is historical and complex, and it keeps going and showing up, right? So again, thinking about the systems, thinking about colorism, some of you who are logged in or watching this, you may be thinking, that's interesting. I didn't know there was a word for it. And the word is colorism. There's lots of information out there about it. Our last form of racism for this evening is environmental racism. So now we're talking about, we're going back to that idea of housing and spaces and places in which Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples and Asian folks, Asian American folks are allowed to be in and not be within, okay? And I'm doing a ton of videos this time because I did a lot of talking last time. And I feel like sometimes, most times, videos are much better. And please let me know if you can't see the video.
Nationally, the facilities where we dump our garbage and process dangerous chemicals tend to be located in poor and minority communities. The people who live there have little or no protection from the industries around them, and things could get worse. So there's this idea of environmental justice. It's pretty simple. Communities shouldn't be forced to deal with more pollution because they belong to a certain race, national origin, or income bracket. Yet America has struggled over the years to implement any serious policy that actually protects these communities. So let's lay out the ways the government has failed them.
We will not allow Warren County to become a dump site.
The fight for environmental justice took off in 1982, when residents of Warren County, North Carolina mounted mass demonstrations against a plan to dump contaminated soil in a landfill in their community. The EPA investigated 4 similar landfills in southern states and found that they were all located in Black or low-income neighborhoods. In 1987, the United Church of Christ Racial Justice Commission found that around the country, hazardous waste facilities were more likely to be located in mostly minority communities. Amid mounting proof, the federal government was forced to act.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush.
So in 1992, President George H.W. Bush founded the Office of Environmental Justice inside the EPA. 2 years later, President Bill Clinton signed an executive order requiring federal agencies to consider environmental justice in all of their policies, as well as extending civil rights protection to environmental discrimination. But Congress never passed a bill to make Clinton's executive order law. Then came George W. Bush. His administration shifted the focus of the Office of Environmental Justice from protecting low-income and minority communities to all people, leaving vulnerable populations without a federal environmental advocate.
80% of New Orleans, including much of downtown, is underwater.
Under Bush, many environmental civil rights claims were rejected or delayed for years. In 2009, after President Barack Obama's election, his administration recommitted to environmental justice.
Generally speaking, in this country, a lot of environmentally problematic facilities tend to be located in places where poor folks live.
Yet, during the 2 years Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House, they didn't file a single bill focused on strengthening environmental justice protections. Passing major environmental legislation faded further when Republicans took control of Congress in the 2010 midterm elections. Now, President Donald J. Trump is making good on his vow to weaken the EPA.
Environmental protection, what they do is a disgrace. Every week they come out with new regulations. They're making it impossible.
Who's going to protect the environment?
They will be fine with the environment. We can leave a little bit.
This budget, a 31% cut to the EPA, $2.6 billion cut away from the EPA. That's what the president wants.
As the EPA loses funding and regulations are rolled back, vulnerable communities may very likely fall through the cracks. I'm Talia Buford. I'll be covering these communities and digging into systemic environmental injustice. If you have something to tell me, email me at talia.buford@propublica.org.
Where did my screen go? Let's see. Sorry, my screen is not moving to the next screen for some reason or another. Let's see. Let's see here. Okay, let's see if I can reshare. Okay. Oh, it just doesn't want to leave my screen. It's just that important. It wants everyone to understand the concept. Let's see here. Stop sharing. Give me a second, please. Sorry about this. For some reason, the presentation just totally disappeared on me. So, Sorry, not sure what happened to the presentation, why it won't move forward. We got to this part and it fast forwarded And it's supposed to keep going, but it's not going any further. Hold on 1 second, please. Let me figure this out. I have an idea. Let's try that. I'll just delete it from the presentation. 12 years in education and you figure out how to do things on the fly. All right, so so more examples of environmental racism. And actually, I'm going to back up some. So something that I really think is important to talk about, and that video really started fairly late in the environmental justice and environmental racism game, is I want to definitely give and talk about the ways, acknowledgement and talk about the ways that Indigenous peoples were pushed and are pushed off of their land consistently, and that being a form of environmental racism. So before we even get to 1980s and 70s and 60s, and Indigenous peoples have been pushed off their land. The reason why we have national parks is to push Indigenous peoples off of their land so that they cannot fish or they cannot collect berries and things that they needed and sustain themselves on those lands. I also found out recently in a talk that I attended that even the national parks were segregated once they were built. Most national parks had a small area, small like parking lot size space where people of color could eat and can do like some different activities during the day, but they could not camp there and actually had to pack up and leave before a certain time, where white Americans could use the entire of all the part of the national parks, right? So when we think about people of color camping and wanting to go out camping, there's a reason why some people have never gone camping or do not camp or don't understand that experience. And it's because for generations, it was not even allowed for them to spend the night or camp or do those types of things. On top of the fact that spending the night or being in the woods as a person of color at night was not safe for hundreds of years, right? So we think about the histories of the environment and spaces, just even before we talk about pollution, before we talk about redlining and housing discrimination, we need to talk about the very beginning, which is Indigenous peoples being pushed off their lands for national parks, Indigenous peoples being pushed off their lands for land grabbing and things like that, so that people can now own housing and farms and things in places that were not supposed to be farmed on. All right, so the next part, another example, people of color represent 56% of the population that live in neighborhoods with toxic release inventory facilities. Most landfills or waste facilities are disproportionately placed near people of color in economically disadvantaged populations, and wastewater storage units from hydraulic fracturing or fracking are disproportionately located in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods or communities of color. And
interrupt real quick. We can't see this screen. If you could try sharing it again.
I love
technology, man.
Technology, and I'm not even
proud of it. Works, but it doesn't always. But I appreciate everybody hanging in there with us as we get it sorted and fixed up for you.
Okay, hold on one. Let's see. Let me try something. Okay. You know what, Annie? I just want to give a shout out to you for just being so flexible and helpful.
Absolutely.
Can you see it now?
We can see the PowerPoint screen. Now it's in slideshow, so we are good to go. Thank you for letting me interrupt you real quick. Sorry about that.
Oh, this is why you're here. This is why Alicia's here.
Definitely. All right.
Like, the flag. So this is the slide I just read, and believe me, what I read was on the slide. So basically, the experiences of Black and Brown Indigenous folks definitely experiencing environmental racism. There's a neighborhood here in Denver where there's a elementary school that's basically almost up under a freeway overpass. And so what is happening is that as the cars go past the overpass, the exhaust falls down onto the bridge overpass and then falls over onto the school space, right? And they've done like all types of sampling of the soil. We know that's a problem, but they're not doing anything about it. And who lives in the spaces and whose children go to that school where all of those emissions coming from the highways go into those children's lungs? Black, brown, and indigenous children, right? So that's a perfect example here in Denver of environmental racism. And then if your mind is saying, well, they should just move. All they have to do is move. Check your racism, check your bias, right? There's more to moving than just moving, right? And people deserve to be able to live where they want to live safely, right? So examples of environmental racism. So again, it's complicated. It's so complicated. And I asked you the question, what percentage of your life is impacted by race? If you're living in a community that's far away from highways, if you're living in a community where you received a decent education, or you did not receive a decent education, if you're living in spaces or been to a national park ever in your life, you have been affected by race, right? If you ever taken a road trip and done some of those outdoor things, you have been impacted by race. Maybe not in a way that you thought in the beginning, but you've been impacted by race. Had good health care, good dental care, but feeling like you can trust your doctors and you know that you don't have to doubt that they're going to manipulate the situation or make you feel a certain way about asking questions. You are being affected by race in a positive manner, but you're still being affected. All right, so we have environmental racism, institutional racism, cultural racism, and interpersonal racism happening every single day, right? What this causes is racial battle fatigue, right? And racial battle fatigue is the everyday and ongoing feelings of heaviness and weightedness of experiencing racism. And this specifically happens to people of color, right? So what is racial battle fatigue? Racial battle fatigue addresses the psychological and physiological strain exacted on racially marginalized groups and the amount of energy lost dedicated to coping with racial microaggressions and racism, right? So the everyday, going to the dentist and experiencing pain for years and years when it shouldn't be painful. Someone else going to their school and seeing the toxins or smelling the toxins of their child's school and they just want to have their child good education. Going and turning in a resume and your resume looks great, but because you have a Black sounding name or a foreign sounding name that you don't get the job. These constant slights and constant macro and micro racial aggressions build up and we start to feel fatigued or worn out. And this quote is from, his name is W.J. Smith. He's a researcher whose whole career in education is on racial macro and microaggressions and racial battle fatigue. So some of the physiological symptoms of racial battle fatigue: tension, headaches, backaches, elevated heartbeat, rapid breathing in anticipation of racial conflict. So you know if you go into the cafeteria and someone's sitting there with a All Lives Matter t-shirt on and you're a person of color and you just don't even want to be bothered with the lunchroom because you don't want the conflict. Upset stomach or butterflies. So you know you're dealing with a racist boss and you've heard them say some things and you have some feelings about them and you don't even want to confront them. Extreme fatigue, right? Having a hard day. I just don't want to talk about it. I just want to go to bed. It's just been a hard day. I just want to go to bed. Ulcers from worrying. Loss of appetite and elevated blood pressure, right? Of course, and all these things shave off years of life from people. Research says that African Americans live 5 years less than other races strictly because of racial battle fatigue and of all the symptoms that we're experiencing with the everyday experiences of interpersonal racism, institutional racism, cultural racism, and environmental racism. And that research is just one race, let alone others. Physiological symptoms of racial battle fatigue: your anxiety, your swearing, inability to sleep, broken sleep, and I have a misspelling here, intrusive thoughts or images, right? Loss of confidence. So That's a huge one in your job. You know, you have someone who's at your job who's causing racial battle fatigue, or a policy in your job, or something that they're starting or practicing that's causing you some stress, and then you're feeling like you're what's the word? Gaslighting. Am I as smart as I thought I was? I thought that I knew this. Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't know what I'm doing, right? So second guessing ourselves and losing our confidence. Difficulty in thinking coherently and being able to articulate, right? Hypervigilance. So overworking, right? Frustration, denial. John Henryism. And I had not heard of that until just recently when I read a book by Dr. Floyd Cobb, but it talks about like this prolonged effort for coping on physical and psychological stressors. So if you ever heard of the term like Black excellence, it's constantly working, improving yourself and overdoing it, right? If we had to do a presentation, you don't just have a presentation, you have a presentation and workbook and flyers, and you go to people's homes, you just going above and beyond to prove yourself as a person of color, right? Emotional and social withdrawal, not hanging out with your friends and family, anger suppression, expressions of anger, and just being silent. Like, I give up, no one listens to me. I've been saying the same thing this person's been saying. Because I'm a person of color, they're not listening. So you just sit there. You silence, and you feel that's a coping mechanism to feel better. Now, if you're listening to this as a white person, you're saying, well, racial battle fatigue, I'm not a person of color, so it doesn't have anything to do with me. I want you to pay attention to the people of color in your spaces, right? Have you noticed a person near you that's been keeping quiet during staff meetings, and they've been really expressive and trying hard when they first got there, and now it just seems like they've kind of slumped off, right? And do we attribute that to laziness? Do we attribute that to something else? Or is it racial battle fatigue, right? Are the people of color in your spaces, your your religious spaces and your work spaces and your clubs, different things like that, are they experiencing racial battle fatigue? Are they worn out from the racism that they are experiencing in that space, right? And it's common. It's not like, oh, just quit your job and work somewhere else. Remember, this is systemic. So it's not that quitting one job and going to another will end the racial battle fatigue. It continues, and it may look different, and it may take longer to show up, but for many, many people of color, they experience this, especially at work. Okay. So then there's a cycle. So you're experiencing these forms of racism, and then you're reacting with racial battle fatigue, and you're experiencing these racism, and you're reacting with racial battle fatigue, and it's going round and around and around and around. And so next week, we're going to be talking about anti-racism, which is a disruption of the cycle, right? And the purpose is to stop it so that we don't keep going around and around and around. And this is the most important part. In order for the anti-racism to work and the cycle to stop, we need to go beyond interpersonal racism, which means going beyond the book club and talking to the racist uncle at Thanksgiving, but thinking about institutions and policies at our jobs and our places of worship, the environment, the spaces that we live in and we work within, and the culture and the things that we feed ourselves and our children. So again, your cycle of oppression. Next week, the next 2 weeks, we're talking about anti-racism, disrupting that cycle. Okay, we'll have time for questions in a minute, but calls to action, just like last week. This says second part, but come back for the third part next Thursday at 6. Yay! Invite someone to join our workshop. We have 2 more in our series, part 1 of anti-racism, part 2 of anti-racism. So they're not too late to join the show. Continue the conversation with your children that you support, talking about these different forms. And I'm going to add one to this. School starting for many of us. And although some of us are at home in our schooling, look at your curriculum. Institutional racism shows up in our curriculum, in the books that we read, in the things that our children are being asked to complete in school, the tasks that they're asked to do and not do. Look for it there as well. And then complete the survey in the chat box. So Alicia's going to put the survey in the chat box. We love to get some feedback, what we could have done better, what went great, what you'd like to know. It's always good. And I'm going to put on the next slide for the thank you slide. And then if we have questions, Annie, because I can't see them right now, feel free to read them to me and I can maybe answer them all.
We had a question in the middle of the presentation about the Crown Act, and they asked, is the Crown Act a national act?
No, it is based in Colorado only. So other states, good question. Other states may have something similar that they are maybe calling it. Like I know that discrimination against hairstyles and textures is a national problem. And I know that multiple states have been discussing it, but it's not called, if there are other states that are talking about it or signing different policies, not called the Crown Act, but there may be other states that are enacting that.
Yeah, I know Jamaica just made the news for something very similar happening there.
Yeah. And Jamaica's had a lot of conversations about hair. For years, I've seen things specifically like having discrimination against people with locks. And like the way that we should be professional in schools around hair, having specific types of hair. And I don't want to generalize. I need to be very careful about what I'm saying because I'm going off of memory. But I know that Jamaica's had a lot of conversations around like professionalism in school and hair care. Any other questions?
Nothing yet. I'll give people a moment to type and kind of process and reflect. I know that that's a lot of new information potentially.
While they're typing, I want to say again for those of us who walked in or came in late, thank you first for coming. Second, if you did not get a chance to download the workbook, please download the workbook, which is, it's in the chat box. And there are at the bottom of each page, so there's a note like interpersonal racism, and then a place for you to type some notes. At the bottom are links for you to click on that have videos, that have articles, lesson plans, and other opportunities. And there's one for institutional racism. There's links for cultural racism. There's links for environmental racism. And the videos that we watched today, some of them are also on the in the workbook. And then I did go ahead and write down the psychological and physiological symptoms of racial battle fatigue for folks so that you can take a look at that or share that. In the article that I got those symptoms from are at the bottom of that link. And then I have a glossary also in here that you should all take a look at if you'd like to get some more information about the things that we discussed last week, we discussed this week, and then for the next workbook, we will have more terms that we can continue to discuss for next week. Yeah. And sorry, one more thing, Annie, I forgot. So I have a Facebook family group page that at the back of your workbook, you can click on the link. And if you have Facebook, and basically there's lots of families having these conversations about racism and anti-racism. And so we just kind of come together, we share resources. This video will be on there a little bit later on, either tomorrow or tonight. So people are just having conversations about race and sharing the experience with each other. It's specific for families. If you don't have a family, that's totally fine, but it definitely focuses on like supporting children of, preschool all the way up to college and beyond. So if you're interested, you can look up on Facebook. It's called Families Having Race Conversations. And you should see my picture there and join the group. That's it.
Fantastic. I don't think we have any questions. I'm trying to see. I know YouTube's always a little bit behind, but I don't see any questions popping up over there either.
Okay.
Yeah, as always, if you have any additional questions, if you're reflecting and you're thinking about this a little bit more, Asia has her email address listed on this slide, or you can feel free to email me as well, and I can pass any of that along as well.
Okay, and Sandra, I see your your suggestion about having the presentation, the workbook 24 hours earlier. Yes, I will do that. I will have it 24 hours earlier for you all. So you'll see that on Wednesday next week. Thank you for that feedback.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for attending, and thank you, Asia, for joining us this evening. We really appreciate you all.
Yeah, no problem. Have a great day.
You too.
Night. Bye.
Take care.